So I'm here with you today to talk about the importance of radiation safety in computed tomography. And unlike many speakers who I'm sure you'll hear from who have incredibly deep technical knowledge of how the technology works and the science that undergirds it, I know this because one of my housemates from medical school is a radiation oncologist, and the last time I heard him present, I couldn't understand a word he said after the first few slides. But what I'm here to talk to you about is how this fits into the broader world of health policy and all the changes that our healthcare system is undergoing right now. So at 30,000 feet, what we see very, very broadly, and this is the landscape on which we're considering radiation safety, evidence is being produced at a very rapid rate, but its incorporation into clinical practice is much slower than that. So that means we've got transparency efforts, also known as report cards, for hospitals, for doctors, for nursing homes, and yet that information doesn't always map as closely as we'd like onto specific diseases or specific opportunities where patients might be expected to have a preference and at the time to think through their feelings about specific treatment options. In general, we face an underperforming healthcare system and untenable cost forecasts, by which I mean huge variations in quality and safety, and, well, cost, we lead the world. And not only that, for all of that expense, the patient is often an afterthought. So what that means is that I'm really pleased to say that in the past decade in particular, we have seen progress in quality and safety improvement, but it's been pretty slow. And not only that, the pace is uneven. So in quality improvement, for example, we tend to do much better in acute care situations. For example, door-to-balloon time, we are doing much, much better when there's an acute coronary ischemic event. For management of common chronic illnesses, not so much. It's also very clear that payment based at least in part on quality and safety performance is here to stay, and that there's more and more building enthusiasm for patient-centered care, very much a work in progress, but a clear recognition that for all of the stuff we do, we don't always apply it to the unique needs and preferences of an individual as well as we could. So just to give you a brief snapshot of what the current system looks like and what the future state looks like, hopefully we're going to be moving from variable quality, expensive and wasteful systems to a place where we have much more consistent or reliable care and lower costs through greater efficiency. Today, for the most part, we pay for volume. In the future, we're going to be paying based on quality of care. Closely related to that, a fee-for-service system means ultimately that we end up with more and more microtransactions. And in the future, increasingly, we're going to be focusing on paying for episodes of care. And historically, and even to this day, most of our strategies for assessing quality of care are based on specific providers and settings, and for the most part, they're process measures. Now, these measures are actually very important because they're actionable and that tells providers what they need to do. What patients and families and others want to know is, what are the outcomes or end results, including patient experience of care? So with that as a backdrop, what I'd like to talk to you about is AHRQ's focus and priorities with respect to radiation safety in CT, and then talk about how this fits into the landscape of where healthcare is moving in the 21st century with a very strong focus on high quality, safe care, and then conclude by talking about where do we go from here. So for those of you not familiar with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, this is just a short sort of orientation slide where the National Institutes of Health support biomedical research focusing on disease mechanisms, pathophysiology, and new kinds of science that I can barely pronounce, but very exciting. And the Centers for Disease Control focuses on population health, community-based interventions, disease detection, as in outbreaks and so forth. AHRQ's focus is the system-wide improvement of healthcare quality. Now, at a glance, what this means is, in terms of how we invest our budget, patient safety is a very, very high priority for us. We also support some work assessing the effectiveness and comparative effectiveness of healthcare interventions, very broadly defined. And we make a lot of data available for research, for assessing quality of care. And very importantly, we fund grants. We fund grants to individual investigators, to centers. We fund support for dissertations, career development awards, and so forth. Our top three focus areas, though, are really safety, quality, and what I'm calling getting to how. If any of you watching this have better wording for that third priority, please send me an email. Patient safety, I think, is self-evident. Since the time of the Institute of Medicine's report almost 15 years ago, which said that 44 to 98,000 people a year die in hospitals every year from avoidable harms, we've seen some improvements, but we have a long way to go. And ultimately, to have a trustworthy care delivery system, we need to make sure that we not only minimize the impact of adverse events, but that we actually prevent them from happening in the first place if we can possibly do so. Quality of care is not just how do I measure quality, although that's very important, and more important, I believe, is how do I improve quality based on what I measured. But it's also very, very importantly about collaboration broadly across the public and private sectors. Because if all of us have our own slightly different metrics, we will predictably increase burden for those delivering care without actually changing quality very much at all. Now, this third priority area interests me a great deal. I'm calling it getting to how. Some people might call it operational knowledge. The question is, how do you make evidence that is produced from the best science available and actionable, and making the right thing the easy thing to do? I'm referring to that as evidence-based process improvements. This is a whole science of itself, but very, very important. It's answering the question, how do we do that? Now, drilling down to radiation safety in CT, so our focus for many, many interventions is efficient use, effectiveness, and safety of medical interventions. Obviously, that's going to be a very different sort of picture for CT scans, for example, than it's going to be for medications and so forth. In terms of medical imaging, what we're trying to focus on is what kinds of benefits are associated with specific types of medical imaging when they're used appropriately, because we know that there are concerns about inappropriate and overuse of some of these technologies. True confession here, when I was training as a resident, I actually lived in a state that still had health planning intact. So anytime a patient needed a CT scan, there was one at the city, and it was not at the medical school. It was at a nearby, very large community hospital. So if your patient needed a CT, you went with them, which meant we did fewer of them. So we need to be thinking, now that we have many, many more facilities, how can we make sure that when we're using this very important imaging, that it's being used as safely as possible and as appropriately as possible? So how do we get to care that is actually safer and better? So first, it's important to ask, where are we anyway? Now, we get to report to the Congress every year on the state of healthcare quality and healthcare disparities. This year, in the next few weeks, will be our 10th such series of reports. Now, the good news is that for every single year, we've seen improvements from one year to the next that are statistically significant. The slightly less good news is that overall improvement remains suboptimal, access to care is not improving yet, and that the pace of change is relatively slow. And few disparities in quality are getting smaller, and almost no disparities in access are getting smaller yet. And we see continued variations in quality of care, not only across types of care, but also in different regions and communities in the country. Now, we've had the privilege of supporting some really exciting work in the appropriate and safe use of radiologic imaging. The rescue trial is actually assessing the impact of coronary CT angiography on the clinical evaluation and management of coronary artery disease. This is a multi-center randomized controlled trial comparing CCTA and single photon emission tomography myocardial perfusion imaging. Wow, is that confusing? I can't even imagine how patients might be expected to remember that. That work is very much in progress, should conclude this September. At UCSF itself, Dr. Rebecca Bindman-Smith is actually leading a very large prospective clinical study identifying unnecessary radiation of patients with suspected renal colic. And the purpose of this is to develop, validate, and test the implementation of a rule to allow appropriate use of a CT scan. So this is a very, very exciting study that is being conducted in emergencies and emergency rooms, and the impact and cost-benefit analysis will be used to determine the decision rule's comparative effectiveness. Now, just a few other projects I wanted to touch on briefly. At Yale, Dr. Jersey Chen has a Career Development Award from us, and he's getting into taking advantage of existing geographic variation in the use of imaging alongside cardiac stress testing. What is the impact on patient outcomes and societal costs? We know there are variations already. He doesn't need to count that. What he's trying to get at, does it matter? Because obviously we can expect that the costs will be higher if we use more imaging. Those of you who may have read Stephen Brill's article in Time magazine recently about why healthcare costs so much will see some very strong opinions voiced about this very topic. This project is going to put some science behind those voices. There's also a terrific project at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which is examining the comparative effectiveness of breast imaging modalities, ultimately trying to provide patients, payers, clinicians, and so forth the best possible science so that they can take advantage of breast imaging modalities so that we have the best rate of detection and diagnosis, but minimize radiation exposure, minimize unnecessary cost expenditures, and also minimize false negatives and so forth. Now, we know from the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, an independent scientific group to whom ARC provides support to make evidence-based recommendations about prevention, that CT colonography is replacing other methods. So these are direct quotes from the clinical considerations in the task force's recent recommendations about screening for colorectal cancer. 2 types of studies to assess the sensitivity of colonoscopy, and both the tandem colonoscopy studies and the CT colonography show that colonoscopy may miss even polyps larger than 10 millimeters, to say nothing of cancers. And recent clinical studies of CT colonography suggest that this screening method may be at least as sensitive as optical colonoscopy at identifying cancer and large adenomas in the community setting. So we can see that imaging can offer us greatly big advances that are very, very important in accuracy of diagnosis and so forth, but we also want to make very, very certain that we're using those as appropriately and safely as possible. So where do we go from here? The increased availability of clinical electronic data is something that we had the privilege of taking advantage of through research investments with the Recovery Act several years ago. And this map just shows you where a lot of these research networks are. Some of these are patient registries, some of these are distributed data networks and so forth, but the collective potential reach of these networks is up to 50 million patients, and this electronic data methods forum is actually very focused on making sure we have the best methods. The point here is that although many clinicians in practice today actually face somewhat arbitrary, I guess they're sometimes called care management guidelines. These are algorithms for what imaging you can order or not. Our highest hope, and consistent with the notion of patient-centered research, is that we could have science to guide the safe, appropriate use of these fantastic technologies. We've also seen, because we support something called a Healthcare Innovations Exchange. This is where people can submit evidence-based innovations and quality tools. This is not like a new kind of CT scanner. It's actually all about how a CT scanner or other intervention might be used in the real world. So at Montefiore in New York City, they shared that their simple algorithm used to promote appropriate use of imaging tests for stable emergency departments with suspected pulmonary embolism. By the way, sharing these innovations is very, very easy. We think it's a great way for others to learn from your work. It's not nearly as hard as a peer-reviewed paper, and really doesn't mean that you couldn't do a submission to a peer-reviewed journal at some future date. But it is a great way to get feedback. And we're also interested not only in what works, but what doesn't. Staying in New York State, the University of Rochester Medical Center submitted a detailed protocol the medical center uses to reduce unnecessary C-spine x-rays for emergency department patients with traumatic injury. Some of these innovations might actually be the basis for future research themselves. Now, patient registries, I think, are increasingly used to inform clinical decision-making, but we know that this very important tool, which can be used both for research as well as for assessing quality of care and so forth, is only as good as the methods that underlie it. So what I'm showing you here is the second edition, but the third edition is coming very soon, on a very rich guidebook, which is a user's guide, and includes such topics as how do you link across different registries, how can these registries be used in product safety assessment, when do you stop a registry, how might registries interface with electronic health records, and so forth. Obviously, imaging and radiation therapy has been the focus of some very, very high-profile press stories, and all of us can understand the concerns that some of those incidents generated. But the real question, and where we focus a lot, is how is it that we can get the best possible information about how to do it right the first time? So what I'm showing you here is a screenshot for something called PS, for Patient Safety Net, which has many online potential innovations that people can try to actually make the use of imaging and other radiologic applications as safe as possible. Very, very recently, which is to say within the past week or so, we made an evidence report available, a systematic review. This is a very, very rigorous review of existing literature focusing on the top practices to make healthcare safer. This included a focus on radiation exposure from fluoroscopy and computed tomography, and also a focus on preventing contrast-induced acute kidney injury. It's online on our website. It was a special supplement to the Annals of Internal Medicine, so I'd commend it for your attention. So the landscape, I'm just going to say, is not going to get stable or boring anytime soon. We're going to continue to produce new evidence. I would predict that inventors and innovators will continue to produce new ways and new, better ways of imaging patients, some of which have literally changed how we understand disease and the impact on patients and so forth. But these questions are going to be enduring. How do we incorporate evidence on safety and quality into this new environment? How do these changes affect patients, providers, and payers? Very importantly, to imaging, how has the nature of evidence changed? And how do we make sure that both that these changes are beneficial and that what we know to be beneficial is put into practice? What this says to me is that increasingly in the future, researchers need to be part of the solution or part of building these solutions. But this is not research as an isolated, independent very intellectual activity. It's still intellectual, but it's very much an activity that involves engaging with decision makers, and that can include clinicians, patients, health system leaders, and so forth, which is, to the minds of many people, far more rewarding, far more likely to have a big impact on how healthcare is delivered, but very, very different than how we've done things traditionally. So I want to thank you for your attention. The fact that you're tuning into this, it seems to me to show that we've got some common concerns about making sure that all patients get the safest care possible. Our intent and highest hope is that we can help support, build the science to make sure that our strategies to try to get to safe care actually are supported by the strongest possible science. Thank you so much for your attention.